tonight we turn to the book of Joshua. We have finished the Pentateuch. Remember, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those 5 books told not only the story of creation, but also the story of the children of Israel, all the way from their slavery in Egypt up to their arrival for the second time in the land of Canaan. That's where we find them now. They have gone through their wilderness wandering, and now they are at the doorstep, so to speak, of the promised land once again. The historical books of the Old Testament, from Joshua through the book of Esther, will cover Israel's history in the promised land. Now, the author of this book is Joshua. If he did not actually sit down and put ink to the page himself, he probably dictated the words to a scribe who wrote them down. The name Joshua means Jehovah is salvation. And the book breaks down into 3 distinct parts. Chapters 1 through 5 describe the activities of the children of Israel as they're entering the promised land. Chapters 6 through 12 describe occupying the land, or overcoming the land, rather. And chapters 13 through 24 describe occupying the land. The central theme of the book is the victory of faith. And we begin looking at the outline of the book of Joshua with chapters 1 through 5 as they're entering the land, the promised land that God had promised all the way back to Abraham. Always remember, God keeps his promises. And he commissioned Joshua for leadership. Joshua was the man chosen to succeed Moses. If you have ever had to follow a very successful quality leader into a position, especially if that leader was the one who started the whole thing, maybe the founder of a company or something, and you're asked to succeed that person, that can be a very tough thing to do. So let's look at just a quick section from chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. And God comes to Joshua, and this is after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord. He came to Joshua and he said this: Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. That's chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. And right off the bat, God gives Joshua a wonderful principle for life when he says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Well, obviously, Joshua knew that. But the idea here is, listen, Joshua, the past is in the past. You will never get where you're going by continuing to do what you've been doing. In other words, we've got to move forward. We've got to take the steps to go in and cross the Jordan and go into the promised land. No one's going to be able to stand against you because I'm with you and I will never leave you. So be strong, be courageous. Don't be discouraged. Don't be afraid. And so Joshua gathered up and sent 2 spies. Yeah, he did, Tracy. Told him to be strong and courageous 3 times. I think partly to make sure that he got it, but also because, Joshua may have needed a little convincing. So Joshua sent 2 spies into Jericho because it was a key city and it was an important city right there at the Jordan River. And so he sent the 2 spies in. And when the king of Jericho was given word about it, he sent out some people to go capture these spies and bring them. But they had already gotten in, and they found themselves at the home of a woman named Rahab, who was a prostitute. Now, why they chose that home, I do not know. Scripture does not explain it. We must only depend on the providence of God that he took the 2 spies and brought them in to the house of Rahab. And she took these 2 men for whatever reason and hid them. And then when the king of Jericho's men came looking for the spies, she told them they were here, but I don't know where they had come from. And when it became dark and it was time to close the city gate, because all big cities close their gates at night, I don't know which way they went, but by that time she had taken them up to her roof and hidden them under stalks of flax. And so the men set out the other way in pursuit of the spies, and as soon as they were gone, the gate was shut. And so these spies had to spend the night there. Once the gates were shut, no one is getting in or getting out of the city, and so they had to stay there. And before they laid down to sleep, the Rahab said to them, I know the Lord has given you this land. All who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, and what you did to Sihon and Og. Those were 2 other cities that the Israelites had already conquered. Now, she says, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you. Spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all that belong to them. If you don't tell what we are doing, they answered, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down with a rope through the window, because her house was actually built into the city wall. And so she was able to open a window and lower them down on the outside of the wall of Jericho. And then she told them, go into the hills and hide there for 3 days. And those guys that the king sent will give up, and then you'll be able to go on back where you came from. Now, just before they left, the men said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless you tie this scarlet cord in this window. And unless you have brought your family into the house, we'll leave everyone in the house alone. But if your family is not gathered in the house when we come to conquer the city, it's on you. And we're released from the oath that you made us swear. And Rahab agreed with that. Now, I want you to note something that you won't get from reading the book of Joshua, but you have to know something about Rahab. And you can just make note of this. In the book of Matthew, chapter 1, verses 1 through 6, it's actually longer than just 6 verses, but for our purposes tonight, we only need the first 6 verses. Matthew records the genealogy of Jesus. And I want you to listen to this. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac, the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. We'll get to Boaz next week, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the King David. King David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife, and the genealogy goes on and on. The point is, there is a direct genealogical line from King David all the way to Jesus. Excuse me. And Rahab is in there. And yes, it's this Rahab who is part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ himself. Always look at the context, and that's part of the reward that Rahab was given because of her protection over the spies that Joshua sent in. Now, in chapter 3, Israel is ready to cross the Jordan River and head back into the Promised Land. And I want you to note, this is the very same place where the first generation of Israelites had been 40 years earlier. That was recorded in Numbers 14. You remember we looked at that. 40 years earlier, that first generation of Israelites got scared and they refused to go in, because the spies brought back a report and said, we can't do it. And only Joshua and Caleb said, yes, we can, because God is with us. They're right back at the same place again. Verse 14 of chapter 3. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now, the Jordan is at flood stage all during the harvest. And I think the writer put that in just to remind us, this is not a fluke. This is not something nature did. This is the hand of God. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. And then in chapter 4, once everyone has crossed, the priests are still standing there. All the people have crossed over on the dry ground where God stopped the Jordan River and let them cross on the dry riverbed. And the priests are still standing there holding the Ark of the Covenant. And while they did, God instructed Joshua to have a man from each of the 12 tribes to take a large stone from the riverbed, not from the bank, from down in that dry riverbed. They were to gather these. Now, I don't think they got little bitty rocks. I'm thinking these are good-sized stones that it would take a strong man to lift. And so a man from each tribe, that's 12 men in all, gathered these stones from the dry riverbed and then brought them up on the bank and built a memorial so that future generations could see that and know what God had done that day. And after the memorial was built, the priests came out of the riverbed and the water returned to its place. And then in chapter 5, the Israelites renew their covenant with God at Gilgal on the Promised Land side of the Jordan River. Then in chapter 6 through 12, we begin the overcoming the land, the conquering part. Now, I got to warn you, a lot of this is bloody. And some people question the goodness of God and whether it was fair or not. And we have to understand our God is God. And he has a plan, and he's going to carry it out. And we have to be careful to avoid the temptation to interpret the actions of God according to our human sensibilities. We are not God. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. And so we begin actually in chapter 5, verse 13, when an angel comes to Joshua and says, here's how this is to take place. But before he did, there in verse 15 of chapter 5, the angel told Joshua, take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy. That, of course, likens back to when Moses met God at the bush that was burning and not consumed, and God told him to take off the sandals because the ground he was standing on is holy. It is the presence of God that makes the ground holy. And once God departs, it's not so holy anymore. It's just ground. But in this case, as Joshua is there and the angel comes and he tells him to take off his shoes because he's on holy ground. And in verses 3 through 5 of chapter 6, the angel gives Joshua specific but very strange instructions. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. And you know, you've heard the story of the Battle of Jericho. The Israelites followed God's instruction to the letter. Day 1, they just marched around carrying the ram's horn. Day 2, they did the same thing. Can you imagine those inhabitants of Jericho standing up on this huge wall looking down, and here comes this group of Israelites, and they march around, and then they go home. And then on the second day, they march around, and then they go home. And this continued for 6 days. But on that 7th day, they blew the trumpets. They blew them, and they blew them, and they made one long blast on the 7th trip around. They went around 7 times on the 7th day, and the walls collapsed. Interestingly enough, there is archaeological evidence of a city that many believe was Jericho, and the rubble of these collapsed walls all around there. There have been some archaeologists that have discovered that. Now, in the course of that conquest, Rahab and all her family were spared, just as had been promised, and everything was destroyed but the silver, gold, bronze, and iron, which was to be collected and put into the treasury of God's house. And they put everyone in the city to death. Then we have a problem, though. In verses 7 and 8, Israel attempts to conquer Ai, which was the next city in their path entering the promised land, and they got thumped. They were beaten badly. And Joshua didn't understand it because, of course, he was convinced that God was with them. They had moved through Jericho like a knife through butter, and now they're at Ai, and they get beaten. And so Joshua did what any time we should do when we don't understand what's going on. He went before the Lord and he prayed, and God told him, Israel has sinned. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever is among you unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. And so they went through this excruciating trial where it started out with the whole nation standing before God as tribes. Then it was narrowed down to this certain tribe. And so the clans within those tribes, within that tribe, they had to stand before God. And then the families within those clans, and then the individuals within those families. And it came to light that a man named Achan of the tribe of Judah had buried a robe, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold inside his tent. And because of the sin of one man, now I believe his family also knew what he did. Because of Achan's sin, the army of Israel had been defeated. And as a result, Achan and his entire family were stoned, which tells us how seriously God takes sin and following his instructions. Remember, I mean, we're in a military siege here. The Israelites are moving into the promised land, and they have to do things the way God told them, or they will not succeed. Yeah, you're right, Mary. He didn't actually come forward, did he? It was only after that long trial. So we can't count it as a confession. He only fessed up when he was caught. And I don't know about you guys, but confessing after you're caught is not quite as pure as outright confession. Now, in chapter 9, the Gibeonites come along, and they actually trick the Israelites into making a treaty with them. They show up, and they're wearing tattered clothes. Their animals look like they've been traveling for weeks or months, and they don't have a lot of food, and they look like this is a group of people. They look like they've traveled and traveled and traveled and traveled, and they're nowhere, their homeland is nowhere near where the Israelites are at this point. Now, truth of the matter is they were right in Israel's path, but they tricked Joshua into making a treaty with them. And because Joshua had given his word and had not consulted the Lord, he had to hold to that treaty. And so immediately, the Israelites had defeated Jericho. They finally took Ai and had a couple other minor victories. And now all of a sudden, there's this section of the promised land that they're not going to take because they made a treaty with the Gibeonites because they were foolish and the Gibeonites tricked them. Then in chapter 10, along come the Amorites, and they are defeated soundly. Even though the king of Jerusalem, now Jerusalem is there. The Israelites did not originally build Jerusalem. It was already there when they arrived. And so the king of Jerusalem formed an alliance of 5 Amorite kings and attacked Gibeon. Now the Israelites have this treaty with Gibeon, so they've got to go help them. And Joshua and the Israelites marched all night and took the Amorites by surprise. And Israel achieved a convincing victory with God intervening in 2 ways. He lengthened the day so the battle could continue because Israel was winning in a rout. And he attacked the Amorites with large hailstones. And from there, the Israelites conquered the rest of the southern cities of Canaan. It says in verses 28 through 43. And in chapter 11, we read of them conquering the northern cities of Canaan. Now, we're not going to go through and read all that and list all those cities, but the territory of the nation of Israel is beginning to expand as they take over more and more and more of the land that has been promised to them. There is a list of the defeated kings in Canaan, because every city, every little area had another king. There's a list of the defeated kings in Canaan in chapter 12. There's 31 of them in all. So Israel is having great success. And then in chapter 13, all the way through to chapter 24, we read about Israel occupying the land. They've conquered nearly all of it. They've conquered enough of it that God instructed Joshua to begin allocating the land to the tribes, to the 12 tribes, including the land that had yet to be conquered, because God said in chapter 13, verse 6, I myself will drive them out before the Israelites. The tribe of Reuben and Gad, along with the half tribe of Manasseh, you remember way back when we were still under Moses' leadership, these folks had said, we want this land on this side of the Jordan River, not on the other side where the promised land is. We like this land. And so the agreement was they could have that as their tribal allotment, so long as they helped the rest of Israel conquer the promised land. So the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and a half of the tribe of Manasseh, they were given land east of the Jordan according to their agreement with Moses. Then Eleazar, Joshua, and the heads of the tribal clans sat down to divide the land west of the Jordan River, and they did this by basically throwing dice. The Bible says it was done by lot. Now, everyone is going to get an equal and fair portion, but the locations of those portions were decided by rolling the dice and leaving it up to the Lord. The Levites were not given a tribal share, because they're the priestly tribe, and they need to spread out, not only to take care of worship in the tabernacle, but also to help the other tribes and to lead their religious activities. And so they were not given a share of land, but they were given cities in each of the tribal lands. Now then shows up Caleb, and I love Caleb. It's in chapter 14, verses 9 through 12. Caleb was of the tribe of Judah. And I want you to read along with me in what Caleb did. Now, he's an old guy by now. Caleb and Joshua and Eleazar are the only ones left from the first generation of Israelites that left Egypt. You remember Caleb and Joshua were the spies that, and actually Eleazar is not of the first generation. He's Aaron's son. I misspoke there. Sorry about that. Caleb and Joshua are the only two left. Eleazar is getting really old because he's had succeeded his father Aaron as the priest. Now, read this with me, chapter 14, verse 9. So on that day, Moses swore to me, this is Caleb speaking, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I'm still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities were large and fortified. But the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. 85 years old, and he said, hey, you give me what Moses promised me, and I'll take my guys, and we'll go conquer it, and I'll lead the way, because I'm just as bad as I was 45 years ago. I love Caleb. I love Caleb. So then in chapter 15, we have Judah's allotment. And then in chapter 16 and 17, we have Ephraim and Manasseh's allotment. Remember, those are the two sons of Joseph. They became recognized as tribes because Joseph was never recognized as a tribe, and the Levites were not recognized as a tribe in terms of receiving land. And so they were given it. Then we have Benjamin's allotment in chapter 18, Simeon's allotment in chapter 19, the first part, Zebulun's allotment in the middle part of chapter 19, Issachar's allotment just after that, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, and then Joshua himself was given the town of Timnath Serah. That's in chapter 19, verses 49 through 51. And in chapter 20, 6 cities of refuge were established. You remember back, I believe it was in the book of Numbers, God told Moses to establish cities of refuge. These were places where someone could go if they were involved in the death of somebody, and it was in doubt as to whether or not they should be stoned, and they could go there and receive a fair trial, and they would not be a victim of a family's need for revenge. They could go there and be protected while the situation was figured out, and then justice would be served. And so these cities of refuge were established to ensure that Israel was a nation of justice. And then cities were given to the Levites as well as pasture land, because Levites got to eat. And so they needed places to raise their flocks and feed them. That's in chapter 21. And then in chapter 22, the tribes of Reuben and Gad, along with the half tribe of Manasseh, were released with Joshua's blessing and allowed to go back east of the Jordan River and take the allotment of land that had been given to them. Then in chapters 23 and 24, and I sure hope you read all of this, we have Joshua's farewell address. Joshua is significantly younger than Moses. I want you to notice that with the changing of the generations and the wandering in the wilderness, the longevity of the people in the biblical era became much less. And that occurred during that wilderness wandering, and as the succession passed from Moses to Joshua, for whatever reason, God did not allow them to live 400 and 500 and 600 years the way they had done back in the book of Genesis. And in chapters 23 and 24, I want you to see to read this with me. Chapter 24, verses 14 through 15. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And so Joshua comes along, and he knows that his time is short. He has accomplished what he set out to do. The nation of Israel has conquered as much of the promised land as they're going to conquer. The conquest is over. And so Joshua makes this address to the Israelites, and he says to them, listen, throw away any of the ideas and the idols that you carried out of Egypt with you, that your parents had in Egypt, that your grandparents had there. Stay away from those things and choose who you will serve. The inference being you're going to serve somebody. So pick who you're going to serve. Are you going to serve the gods that our ancestors worshipped in Egypt? Are you going to serve the gods of these Amorites that we're standing in their country now? We've conquered all this. Or are you going to serve the Lord? And as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And so he brought the nation to a very important place of decision. And I suppose that's a decision we all have to make. And then chapter 24 is really a kind of epilogue. And for obvious reasons, nobody thinks Joshua wrote this part, because it says in chapter 24, verses 29 and 30, Joshua died. So he didn't write this. Joshua died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. And then in verse 31, Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. And then in verse 32, Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem. Here it is, some 45 years after they left Egypt. They took Moses' bones with them because he had been dead for generations, and it was his wish to be buried in the promised land. And in faith, Joseph told them, bury me there. Take me back to the promised land. And it's recorded in Exodus that they took him out with them. And then here's the fulfillment of that in Joshua 24:32. Now, verse 33 records that Eleazar, son of Aaron, died and was buried at Gibeath. And so by the time chapter 24 was added to complete Joshua's account, it's likely that Caleb had also died. And this brought to an end the entire first generation of the Israelites, because only Joshua and Caleb were still there. And so we have come to the conclusion of a wonderful, amazing period of history in the nation of Israel, in which they took up the covenant that had been given to Abraham. They found themselves in Egyptian slavery. They had gone through the Exodus with Moses, and under God's leadership, Moses had established their religious and civic way of life. He gave them a way of governance. He also gave them a way of worship. And all of that was set, and then they entered in to the promised land after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and claimed that which had been promised to Abraham all those years before. And so now we come to the end of this period in the life of Israel. They are no longer Bedouins. They're not traveling through the wilderness. They're certainly no longer slaves. They have thrown that off long ago. And now they are an established nation in the promised land. And if you read the book of Judges and the books of Judges and Ruth for next week, we'll find out if they're able to hold it. Thanks for being with us tonight, everybody. God bless you all. Good night.